Empire of Blood. Episode 15. The East is red, the earth is bare. Mao Zedong and the architecture of mass death in China. The grain is in the warehouse. The children are hungry. This is the central fact of the autumn of 1959 in Henan province. And it is a fact so absurd, so geometrically cruel, that the people living inside it struggle to hold it in their minds as a fact rather than as a nightmare from which they are about to wake. The grain is there. They grew it. Their hands put the rice shoots in the mud in spring. Their backs bent over the flooded paddies through summer. Their arms swung the sickles in autumn. The harvest exists. It is stacked and counted and guarded. They are not permitted to eat it. A peasant farmer, we will call him by a name that could belong to any of 10 million men in Henan that year, has a name that is not his but stands in for the fact that his name was not recorded anywhere that matters. Sits in the doorway of the communal dining hall that replaced his family's kitchen 18 months ago. His youngest child, a girl of perhaps 4, sits beside him. She's not crying. That stopped some weeks ago, the crying. Now she simply watches things with eyes that have become somehow larger and quieter than a child's eyes are supposed to be. The watching is harder to look at than the crying was. The communal dining hall was the great innovation of the people's commune. When the communes were established in 1958, across the length and breadth of rural China, one of the first and most celebrated features was the communal kitchen, the gong shi tang. Everyone ate together, and the party cadres explained that this was liberation. No more women bent over individual cook stoves, no more families isolated in their private hunger. The collective ate together as a family, and there was enough for all. The propaganda painting showed tables laden with food, broad-faced workers raising chopsticks in a toast to the new era, children fat-cheeked and laughing. The dining hall in this village has not served a full meal in 6 weeks. The cadre who runs the commune, a young man from the county party office, someone's nephew, someone who was a factory apprentice 3 years ago and is now the de facto governor of 4,000 lives, has a problem that he cannot solve and cannot admit. The grain quota set by the county for this commune is not achievable. It was never achievable. It was set based on harvest reports that the county itself had inflated, because the county quota was set by the prefecture based on numbers that the prefecture had inflated, because the prefecture was competing with other prefectures to demonstrate the success of the Great Leap Forward, and the numbers had been climbing in a spiral of competitive fantasy ever since Mao Zedong stood at a meeting in Chengdu in March 1958 and praised the boldness of the most optimistic projections. The actual harvest is perhaps a quarter of what was reported. The cadre knows this. He walks between the fields every day. He has eyes. But the grain that the state requires must come from somewhere, and since there is only one somewhere available, the village's actual stored grain, should the grain the village needs to eat through winter and to plant in spring, that is where it comes from. The state's grain teams arrive with their carts and their ledgers and their authority, and the grain goes into the carts, and the carts go to the collection point, and somewhere up the chain of command a report is filed saying that the Xinjiang region of Henan province has met its quota. And somewhere further up the chain of command a man reads this report with satisfaction. That man does not see the child in the doorway. What happened in Henan in 1959 and 1960 is known to Chinese historians, though for decades it was not known publicly, and in some important senses it is still not known, not admitted, not taught in schools, not carved into monuments. What happened is this. People starved. Not in ones and twos, not in the quiet, ordinary numbers that famine produces at its edges, but in masses. In Xinjiang prefecture alone, one prefecture in one province, somewhere between 1 and 2 million people died of hunger between 1959 and 1960. The prefecture had a population of about 8 million. 1 in 4. 1 in 5. The numbers depend on which set of records you are using, and the records were kept by people who had very strong incentives to keep them inaccurately. The girl in the doorway does not have a name in any archive. Her father's name, if it exists anywhere, exists in a village register that may or may not have survived. They are among the tens of millions. The estimates run from 15 million to 45 million, depending on methodology and access to data, who died in what historians call the Great Chinese Famine, which was not primarily a famine in the sense of a natural disaster, but a famine in the sense of a deliberate policy producing a foreseeable result. The state took the food. The people died. The state knew. And at the top of the state, reading reports of impossible harvests and industrial triumphs in a country that was quietly emptying out, sat Mao Zedong. He knew. The evidence for this is extensive and specific, and we will come to it. But the knowledge did not change the policy. The policy continued. The grain continued to be taken. The children continued to die. Today we are going to try to understand how a man who spent his life fighting for the liberation of the Chinese peasantry built a machine that killed them by the tens of millions, and why he kept it running even after he knew that the country that revolution. Made to understand what Mao built, you need to understand what China was before he built it, and what China had been through in the century that preceded 1949. Because the People's Republic of China was not born into a stable world, it was born out of 100 years of catastrophe, and the weight of that catastrophe shaped everything that came after it, including the willingness of ordinary people to accept suffering in the name of the project that was supposed to end suffering. In 1839, China was the largest and, in many ways, most sophisticated civilization on Earth. The Qing dynasty governed 400 million people. The empire produced the majority of the world's silk, tea, and porcelain. Its bureaucracy was 1,000 years old. Its literary tradition older than most European nations. Its scientific and technological achievements substantial. And then the Opium Wars began, and the century of humiliation, as the Chinese call it, with a phrase that carries enormous emotional and political weight, started its long damage. The British forced the Chinese market open for the opium trade at gunpoint in 1839. The treaty ports were imposed, giving European powers extraterritorial jurisdiction in major Chinese cities, meaning that a British citizen in Shanghai was answerable to British law, not Chinese law, a daily demonstration of enforced subservience. The Taiping Rebellion, which broke out in the 1850s and lasted until 1864, killed somewhere between 20 and 30 million people. One of the deadliest conflicts in human history, he fought entirely on Chinese soil between a millenarian Christian movement and the Qing dynasty. The Boxer Rebellion of 1899 to 1901 brought foreign armies into Beijing and resulted in yet another punishing treaty. The Qing dynasty collapsed in 1911 and was replaced by the Republic, which immediately fragmented into the chaos of warlord period. Regional military commanders fighting each other across the country. The central government a fiction. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931 and launched a full-scale invasion of China in 1937. The Nanjing Massacre, the systematic killing and rape of civilians in Nanjing over 6 weeks in late 1937, killed somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 people, depending on the source. And the range of the estimate itself tells you something about the difficulty of accounting for mass atrocity in real time. The Second World War in the Pacific formally ended in 1945, but China did not experience peace. The civil war between the communists and the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, which had been suspended during the Japanese occupation, resumed immediately. It ended in 1949 when Chiang Kai-shek's forces were pushed off the mainland to Taiwan, and Mao Zedong climbed the rostrum at Tiananmen Gate in Beijing on October 1st, 1949, and proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. He said in that moment, "The Chinese people have stood up." Think about the weight of those words in that context. A civilization that had spent a century on its knees, that had been forced to accept treaties it had not negotiated, laws it had not made, the presence of foreign soldiers in its own cities, of the humiliation of being treated as a backward country unworthy of the dignity of self-determination, was standing up. For the enormous majority of the Chinese people who heard those words, they represented something real, something that had been paid for in extraordinary suffering and was now, at last, achieved. The revolution was not merely a political event. It was a redemption, the architecture of the new China. The People's Republic began its existence with genuine achievements. Land reform, the redistribution of agricultural land from landlords to peasants, was something that hundreds of millions of rural Chinese had been waiting for through decades of feudal tenancy. The communist land reform of the early 1950s gave land to families that had worked land they did not own for generations. But the response was not primarily ideological. Peasants did not become communists because of land reform. They became loyal to the government that gave them land because the land was real and tangible and represented the most basic form of material security they had ever possessed. The early 1950s also saw significant improvements in public health, literacy, and infrastructure. Vaccination campaigns reduced the incidence of diseases that had killed millions. Literacy programs extended basic education to communities that had never had access to it. The new government built roads and railways and dams and factories. It unified a country that had been fragmented for decades. It expelled the foreign powers that had maintained extraterritorial privileges in the treaty ports. By objective measures of national development, and the first years of the People's Republic represented genuine progress. But the People's Republic was also a system organized around the absolute authority of the Chinese Communist Party, and within the party, around the increasingly absolute authority of Mao Zedong. The political system that Mao built in the early 1950s, modeled on the Soviet Stalinist system he had studied and admired, though he would later claim to have surpassed it, was designed to convert individual compliance into political loyalty and to treat any deviation from the party line as a form of treason. The apparatus of enforcement was comprehensive. Neighborhood committees that monitored residents' political reliability, work unit files that recorded every individual's class background and political history, also mass campaigns that periodically mobilized the population against designated enemies. The first major mass campaign was the campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries, which ran from 1950 to 1953. It targeted former nationalist officials, landlords, members of secret societies, and anyone else designated as a threat to the new order. The number of executions during this campaign is estimated at between 700,000 and 2 million people. Many of the executions were public, conducted at mass rallies, witnessed by the community, designed to demonstrate the power of the state and the cost of resistance. This is the first thing you need to understand about the People's Republic. It was born in blood, and it was maintained in fear, and the campaigns of mass death that followed in the 1950s and 1960s were not aberrations from the system. so they were expressions of the system, applications of its logic to new problems. The Great Leap Forward. The machine accelerates. The Great Leap Forward was announced in 1958. In its official framing, it was an industrial and agricultural campaign designed to transform China from a developing country into a major world power in 15 years. Mao had concluded, on the basis of his reading of the Chinese economy and the Soviet example, that China could achieve in a single generation what had taken the industrialized countries a century. He believed that the key ingredient was human will, that the Chinese people, properly mobilized, properly organized, properly motivated by revolutionary consciousness, could overcome any material limitation, and the two central programs of the Great Leap Forward were collectivized agriculture and the backyard steel campaign. The agricultural communes, which merged the smaller cooperatives that had already replaced individual family farming, created production units of between 1,000 and 10,000 households, living and working as a collective, eating in communal dining halls, raising children in communal nurseries, submitting all agricultural production to the state for distribution and sale. Private cooking, private food storage, and private farming were eliminated. The family, as an economic unit, was dissolved into the commune. The backyard steel campaign ordered every commune and every workplace to produce steel using small furnaces built on site. The goal was to match British steel production within 15 years. The campaign mobilized something like 90 million people. Workers left their factories. Farmers left their fields at harvest time to tend the furnaces. Women and children fed fuel into the fires night and day. The results were, in terms of agricultural output, catastrophic. The harvest of 1958 was left partially in the fields because the labor force had been redirected to steel production. The results were, in terms of steel production, nearly worthless. The iron and steel produced in backyard furnaces was of such poor quality that it was essentially unusable for industrial purposes. The combination of these two programs, the collectivization that stripped families of control over their food supply, and the backyard steel campaign that removed labor from agriculture at critical moments, produced the conditions for the famine. And the production quotas set by the state were based on the fantastical harvest figures that local officials had reported to demonstrate the success of the Great Leap Forward. When the actual harvest fell catastrophically short of those figures, the state continued to requisition grain at the original quota levels, because the official harvest figures said there was enough grain to meet the quotas. And the people who knew there wasn't enough grain, the local officials, the commune cadres, the farmers themselves, could not say so, because to say so was to admit that the Great Leap Forward was failing, and to say that was to commit political suicide. The famine was not a secret. It was a silence enforced at every level of a system specifically designed to make the truth unspeakable, the propaganda and the reality. While the famine was consuming the countryside, the propaganda apparatus of the People's Republic was describing a miracle. Chinese newspapers reported record harvests. Official publications featured photographs of peasants standing beside impossibly abundant grain piles. In some of the most famous images, the piles were theatrical constructions, grain borrowed from neighboring fields and stacked for the photograph, to be dispersed afterward. Radio broadcasts announced the successful overfulfillment of production quotas by margins of 50%, 100%, 300%. Foreign visitors, journalists, diplomats, sympathetic leftists from Europe and America, were shown model communes where the tables were full and the workers' faces shone with revolutionary enthusiasm. Most of them saw what they were shown and reported what they saw. The foreign dimension of the propaganda deserves a moment of attention because it reveals something about the specific nature of the information problem. Western left-wing intellectuals who visited China in the late 1950s and wrote admiringly of the Great Leap Forward were not all fools or liars. Some of them were intelligent people who were shown carefully constructed evidence of success and had no framework for identifying the construction. The model commune existed. The well-fed workers existed. The tables of food existed. What didn't exist was the ability to travel freely, to visit unannounced, to talk to people without a minder present, to see the same village in January that you had seen in October. The propaganda was not merely external-facing, and it was the medium through which the system operated internally. Local officials who reported accurate harvest figures risked being accused of sabotaging the Great Leap Forward, of lacking revolutionary spirit, of being rightists who doubted the wisdom of the party. The career incentives, the political incentives, and the physical safety incentives all pointed in the same direction. Report success, inflate the numbers, compete with the neighboring county for the distinction of the most extraordinary achievement. The result was a cascade of fiction moving upward through the bureaucratic hierarchy, each layer adding a little more implausibility until the numbers that reached Mao's desk were so detached from reality that they would have been recognizable as fantasy to anyone outside the closed world of party reporting. And the distances involved were vast. China in 1958 was a country of 600 million people, spread across a territory larger than the continental United States, with communication infrastructure that was limited and information flow that was controlled by the same political apparatus that was producing the false numbers. A provincial party secretary in Henan could know that his province was starving and could file reports showing prosperity, and those reports would travel upward through the system while the reality stayed in the fields, invisible to anyone whose position gave them the power to change it. Mao was not outside that world. He was at the center of it. And the question of what he knew and when, and what he did with that knowledge, is one of the central questions of modern Chinese history. And a peasant who never forgot and never forgave. Mao Zedong was born on December 26, 1893 in Lushan, a village in Hunan province in south-central China. His father, Mao Yicheng, was what the Chinese called a zongnong, a middle peasant, a farmer prosperous enough by rural standards to own his land and occasionally hire labor, but emphatically not a member of the gentry or the educated class. His mother, Wen Qimei, was a devout Buddhist, gentle by the accounts of those who knew her, a woman who provided a warmth in the household that her husband's temperament did not. The father is important. Mao Rensheng, the name Mao Yicheng used in some contexts, was strict, frugal, quick to anger, and determined that his son would earn the family's food rather than lose himself in books. He beat Mao regularly. He worked him hard in the fields, for he monitored the household accounts with a miser's precision and accused his son of laziness when the young Mao preferred reading to harvesting. The relationship between father and son, by Mao's own account in his conversations with the American journalist Edgar Snow in 1936, was one of sustained conflict. A conflict in which the child learned, early and thoroughly, the techniques of resistance. When the father humiliated him publicly, Mao threatened to jump in the pond. The father backed down. When the father demanded submission, Mao discovered that a sufficiently credible threat of self-destruction was a form of leverage. This is not an insignificant biographical detail. So the child who discovered that extreme resistance works, that the threat of total self-destruction can force a more powerful adversary to yield, is the man who would later practice the same logic in revolutionary politics, in military strategy, and eventually in governing a country. The willingness to accept enormous costs in pursuit of a goal, the conviction that the side willing to bear more suffering will ultimately prevail, the belief that leverage comes from the credible demonstration of radical commitment. All of these would become core features of Mao's political and military style, and all of them are visible in embryonic form in the household of Mao Yichang. Mao's mother died in 1919 when he was 25. His father had died the year before. By his own account, though he mourned his mother and felt nothing particular about his father, some biographical accounts suggest this is more complicated than it appears, that the emotional landscape of the family was more nuanced, that the relationship with the father was not simply adversarial. But what Mao chose to remember and to report was the adversarial account. He constructed a father narrative that served his later political purposes, the story of a young man who had learned to resist authority and had been proven right. Whether it was entirely accurate is less important for our purposes than the fact that it was the story Mao told about himself, the education of a revolutionary. Mao was educated in the traditional Confucian system as a child. The 4 books, the 5 classics, the accumulated canon of Chinese moral and political philosophy that had been the foundation of Chinese elite education for 2,000 years. He hated it. He found the classics dry and the rote learning stupefying, and he preferred the popular novels that he read by lamplight when his father thought he was sleeping. Water Margin, Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Journey to the West, the great adventure stories of the Chinese literary tradition, stories of rebel heroes, of armies and battles and men who defied corrupt authority to serve a higher justice. He read these the way boys throughout history have read their equivalent, with the total absorption of someone who is finding in fiction the version of themselves they want to become. He left Lushan for the first time in 1910, at the age of 16, to attend a modern school in Jiangxi, the nearest county town. The school taught Western subjects alongside Chinese classics, mathematics, natural science, geography, a smattering of world history. For a boy who had grown up in a single village, the effect was something like the opening of a window. The world was larger than he had known, and its problems were interconnected in ways that his village education had not suggested. And there were ideas abroad in that world, ideas about revolution, about democracy, about the relationship between the state and the governed, that were directly relevant to the China he was living in. The 1911 revolution, the collapse of the Qing dynasty, and the establishment of the Republic broke out while Mao was at school. He joined a Republican military unit briefly. He spent 6 months as a soldier without seeing significant action, and then left the army when the revolution seemed to have succeeded. He returned to school. He read voraciously. He moved to Jiangxi, the provincial capital of Hunan, and enrolled in a teacher's training school that would occupy him for the next 5 years. The years at the first provincial normal school in Jiangxi were the years that made Mao's intellectual character. He read Chinese and Western political philosophy with equal appetite. Traditional Chinese statecraft, Darwinian evolutionary theory, Rousseau and Milton Adam Smith, and eventually Marx. He developed a conviction which he would hold for the rest of his life, that ideas were the primary moving force of history, that what changed the world was not economic conditions or material forces alone, but the consciousness of human beings, their willingness to think differently about their situation and act accordingly. This was a Marxist position, but it was also a voluntarist position, an insistence on the primacy of human will over structural constraint. And it was this voluntarism, this belief that sufficiently motivated people could overcome any material obstacle, that would ultimately produce the great leap forward. He also developed at Jiangxi the physical and psychological habits of a man who was building himself into something. He swam in cold rivers in winter to harden himself. He slept outdoors in autumn. He took long hikes through difficult terrain. He was, since in the vocabulary of his own era, cultivating his will and his body simultaneously, performing a kind of self-construction that was both personal and political. The future leader of China was, at 20, literally trained. He attended lectures at the university. He tried to speak to prominent professors. Several of them could not be bothered to engage with a library assistant. He felt this acutely, with the sensitivity of a man who had learned early to monitor the distribution of respect and disrespect, and to remember both with equal precision. He was not welcomed into the intellectual circles of the university as an equal, and the experience left a residue of class resentment that sat beneath his Marxist theory, and gave it an edge that purely theoretical conviction could not have produced. His later campaigns against intellectuals, the 100 Flowers reversal, the anti-rightist movement, the Cultural Revolution's assault on teachers and professors, were not purely tactical. There was, in each of them, something that looks like the settling of a personal account. The event that clarified Mao's political direction was the May 4th movement of 1919. The Versailles Peace Conference, which ended the First World War, assigned the former German treaty ports in China, Shandong province, to Japan rather than returning them to Chinese sovereignty. China had entered the war on the Allied side precisely in order to claim this concession, and the betrayal at Versailles was experienced as exactly the kind of humiliation that the century of humiliation had been built from. The response in China was an explosion of nationalist outrage. Student demonstrations, boycotts of Japanese goods, mass political mobilization on a scale that China had not seen before. For Mao, watching from Beijing, in the May 4th movement demonstrated something he had been theorizing but not yet seen in practice, the political energy of the awakened mass. The Chinese people, properly aroused, were a force of extraordinary power. He returned to Hunan and began organizing. He set up study groups, a students' association, a newspaper that he edited himself. He became a professional political organizer, and he discovered that he was very good at it, that he had a talent for reading rooms and crowds and situations, for knowing what argument would move which audience, for building coalitions between groups whose interests partially aligned. He also discovered something else, that he enjoyed it. That the work of politics, the meetings, the arguments, to the organization of people toward a shared purpose, was not something he did reluctantly in service of a goal. It was the thing itself. He became a founding member of the Chinese Communist Party at its first Congress in Shanghai in July 1921. He was 27 years old, and he had found the work he was made for. The years between 1921 and 1927 were years of political education and political catastrophe. The Communist Party allied with the Nationalist Party of Chiang Kai-shek in a united front, working together against the warlords who controlled much of China's territory. The alliance held as long as both parties needed each other. In April 1927, Chiang turned on his communist allies in a massacre, the White Terror, that killed thousands of communist organizers in Shanghai, Guangzhou, and other cities, even destroyed the party's urban base almost overnight. Mao, who had been working in the countryside of Hunan, survived. The experience of 1927 confirmed for him a conclusion he had already been moving toward. The future of the Chinese Revolution was not in the cities but in the countryside, not in the urban working class that orthodox Marxism identified as the revolutionary subject, but in the Chinese peasantry. 400 million people, the vast majority of China's population, the people whose labor produced the country's wealth and who received in return exploitation and contempt. In 1927, Mao wrote his report on the Hunan peasant movement, a document of fierce, visceral energy that described the peasant uprisings he had witnessed in Hunan with something close to exhilaration. Then he described the forces of revolution as a mighty storm, a hurricane, a force so swift and violent that no power could hold it back. He described, with obvious approval, the public humiliation of landlords, the dunce caps, the parades through the streets, the reversal of every accumulated shame. This is not the language of political analysis. It is the language of prophecy, of a man who has found his subject and his mission simultaneously. And it contains already the celebration of public humiliation as a political instrument that would reach its terrifying culmination in the Cultural Revolution 40 years later. The Long March and the Cult of Survival. The years between 1927 and 1935 were years of survival, and survival was what Mao did best. Now, the communist base areas in Jiangxi and Hunan were repeatedly attacked by nationalist forces in a series of encirclement campaigns. The communists developed guerrilla tactics, mobile warfare, avoiding the enemy's strength, attacking his weakness, never fighting from a fixed position, always maintaining the capacity to retreat and reconstitute. These tactics, which Mao articulated in a series of military writings that became foundational texts of revolutionary warfare worldwide, were born of necessity. A small force that fights a large force on the large force's terms will lose. A small force that determines the terms of engagement can survive and eventually prevail. In 1934, the Jiangxi Soviet was in danger of being destroyed by Chiang's fifth encirclement campaign. The party made the decision to break out and march, the Long March, but which covered approximately 9,000 kilometers over 370 days, from Jiangxi in the southeast to Yan'an in the northwest, through some of the most difficult terrain in China. Of the approximately 80,000 to 100,000 people who set out, somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 arrived. The deaths were from combat, from cold, from starvation, from disease, from drowning at river crossings. The Long March was, by any objective measure, a military catastrophe. It became the founding myth of the People's Republic. The Long March, in the official narrative, was a demonstration of the unconquerable will of the Chinese Communist Party, proof that no obstacle could break a revolutionary force motivated by correct ideology. The survivors were heroes. The casualties were martyrs. The journey itself was transformed, so in the telling and retelling over subsequent decades, from a desperate retreat into a deliberate test of revolutionary character. It was during the Long March at the Zunyi Conference in January 1935 that Mao consolidated his control over the party. He had been in a minority faction for years, his military line criticized and overruled by the party leadership and by Soviet advisors. At Zunyi, amid the crisis of the march, he made his case and prevailed. From Zunyi onward, Mao was effectively the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. It would take another 14 years to found the People's Republic, but the political authority was established there in a conference room in Guizhou, in the middle of one of the most arduous marches in modern military history. And the Long March also reinforced in Mao a conviction that would prove catastrophic in power, the conviction that the willingness to endure suffering was, in itself, the key to victory. He had survived when many hadn't. The party had survived when most armies in its position would have been destroyed. The conclusion he drew was not that the party had been lucky, or that circumstances had favored its survival, but that ideological commitment and revolutionary will could overcome any material condition. If you believed firmly enough, if you pushed hard enough, if you demanded enough from yourself and from your followers, the objective world would yield to your determination. This belief is the seed of every catastrophe that followed. Filed that away. Yan'an and the making of the Maoist system. The base at Yan'an, up in the low-S plateau of Jiangxi province, was where the Maoist system was fully elaborated before it had a country to operate on. The Yan'an period, from 1935 to 1947, was the laboratory in which Mao tested the methods of ideological control, the techniques of mass mobilization, the political culture of the Communist Party that would govern China for the rest of the century. The Yan'an Rectification Campaign of 1942 to 1944 was the first full expression of what would become a recurring feature of Maoist governance, the political campaign. The campaign was officially directed against incorrect thinking within the party, against dogmatism, against subjectivism, against what Mao called the eight-legged essay style that copied Soviet models without adapting them to Chinese conditions. In practice, and it was directed against anyone in the party who had independent political views that might compete with Mao's authority. The campaign used methods that the Cultural Revolution would later apply at enormous scale. Study sessions, self-criticism sessions, denunciations, public confessions. Intellectuals and party members who had views that differed from Mao's were required to submit written self-criticisms, to attend sessions where their errors were discussed by their peers, to demonstrate through the performance of submission that they had understood and corrected their mistakes. The technique worked, not in the sense of changing people's minds, but in the sense of changing their behavior, which in a political system where behavior was what was monitored, amounted to the same thing. Wang Shiwei, and a writer who published an essay in the Yan'an newspaper criticizing the hierarchical privileges of party officials, who pointed out that the food served at official banquets was different from the food available to ordinary workers, that the Yan'an system was reproducing the inequalities it had promised to abolish, was subjected to denunciation sessions and eventually imprisoned. He was executed in 1947 during the retreat from Yan'an on Mao's personal order. He had written a critical essay in a party newspaper in a supposedly liberated zone. He was killed for it. Wang Shiwei's case is a specific and documented example of something that is easy to state in the abstract but worth holding in the particular. The system of political terror that would later kill millions in China was not invented in 1949 or in 1957 or in 1966. And it was invented in Yan'an, tested on the communists themselves, refined over the years of the Civil War, and deployed at national scale the moment the party had a national government to deploy it with. Power and the problem of belief. Mao assumed national power in 1949 at the age of 55. He had spent 30 years as a revolutionary, 22 of them in the wilderness, literally, in some cases, in the mountains and caves and low plateau villages of inland China, far from the coastal cities, far from the international connections that linked other communist movements to their Soviet patrons, building the revolution from the ground up in the poorest and most remote parts of the country. He brought to power a specific and fully formed worldview that was not simply Marxism and not simply Leninism, and not simply Chinese nationalism, but a synthesis of all three inflected by his own personality and experience. He believed in struggle, not merely as a political technique, but as a moral value, as the mechanism by which human beings developed their capacities and history moved forward. He believed that the principal enemies of China were not merely the nationalists and the imperialists he had defeated, but an internal tendency toward passivity, toward comfort, toward the loss of revolutionary fervor that had destroyed previous revolutionary governments. He believed that the revolution must be continuous, that there could be no stable endpoint, no achieved utopia, because achieved utopias become complacent, and complacency is the death of revolutionary energy. These beliefs had consequences. A leader who believes in continuous struggle will find reasons to struggle. A leader who distrusts stability will manufacture instability. A leader who believes that suffering builds character will be willing to impose suffering. And a leader who has spent 30 years in conditions of extraordinary hardship, who has watched his comrades die and survived by being harder and more calculating than the forces arrayed against him, may find it genuinely difficult to see the difference between the suffering that revolution requires and the suffering that power should prevent. There is a specific and documented moment in 1959 that crystallizes this problem. At the Lushan conference, a meeting of party leaders in July and August of 1959, held at a scenic mountain resort in Jiangxi, while the famine was killing people in the provinces below. Peng Dehuai, the Minister of Defense and one of the most respected military commanders in the party, submitted a private letter to Mao criticizing the Great Leap Forward. Peng's letter was measured and specific. It identified the problems with the commune system, the inflated production figures, the transfer of labor from agriculture to steel production, the resulting food shortages. He did not attack Mao personally. He did not call for Mao's removal. He asked, as a senior official with decades of loyal service, that the policies be reconsidered. Mao circulated the letter to the entire conference. He announced that Peng was leading an anti-party clique. He demanded that every participant declare their position. The result was predictable. Peng was stripped of all his positions, subjected to public denunciation, and spent the following years in internal exile. He died in 1974 during the Cultural Revolution in detention of untreated cancer. The Lushan Conference is the moment when the question of Mao's knowledge of the famine becomes unambiguous. After Lushan, after the purging of the one senior official who had clearly named the problem, the Great Leap Forward did not end. It intensified. Grain requisitions increased. The pressure on local officials to report impossible harvests continued. The famine, which might have been moderated by a policy change in the summer of 1959, was instead allowed to run for another 2 years, killing additional millions who would have survived if the policies had changed when the evidence demanded it. He knew. He chose. He let it continue. Lushan and the decision to continue. The Lushan Conference of July and August 1959 is one of the most consequential single events in the history of the People's Republic, and it is worth spending real time with because it is the moment when the trajectory from policy, failure to mass death becomes a matter of deliberate choice rather than ignorant neglect. By the summer of 1959, the evidence of the famine was available to anyone who chose to look at it. Reports were coming in from provincial officials who could no longer maintain the fiction of success. Reports describing abandoned villages, grain shortfalls, deaths. Some provinces had sent delegations to Beijing trying to raise alarms. Some local officials had begun quietly reducing grain procurement. The signals were there. The disaster was not invisible. Peng Dehuai had gone to Hunan in June and seen the conditions there firsthand. He had talked to people. He had watched children in the condition that the peasant's daughter had been in, that particular terrible stillness that malnutrition produces in small children. He was a soldier who had spent decades fighting for the liberation of exactly these people, and he was watching the government he served killing them. He wrote Mao a private letter. He used careful language. He cited specific problems with specific policies. He said that the backyard steel campaign had been a mistake. that the commune system needed reform, that the production statistics were unreliable. He was asking Mao to hear the truth and act on it. Mao circulated the letter to the entire conference without Peng's permission. He called it an attack on the party. He demanded that every participant at Lushan take a position. He framed the question not as a policy debate, but as a loyalty test. Are you with the revolution or against it? Are you with me or with this man who is questioning the great leap forward? In the political culture that Mao had built, this framing left only one possible answer for anyone who wanted to survive politically. The delegates lined up against Peng. Some of them believed what they were saying. Some of them did not. Most of them had not survived to become senior party figures by choosing principle over political survival. Peng Dehuai was stripped of his position as Minister of Defense, stripped of all his military commands, and subjected to a denunciation campaign. He was placed under house arrest. His former colleagues who had privately agreed with his letter were now required to denounce him publicly, and some of them did so with a vehemence that was inversely proportional to their private convictions. The aftermath of Lushan was, in terms of the famine's death toll, catastrophic. In the months following the conference, Mao launched a new campaign against right opportunism, against officials who had been insufficiently enthusiastic about the great leap forward, who had reduced grain procurement, who had allowed peasants to keep food they needed. Procurement quotas were raised. Officials who had been moderating the excesses were replaced by ones who would not. The famine, which had been bad in 1958 and 1959, became its worst in 1960. The historian Frank Quota, working from the provincial archives, has documented the specific mechanisms. In the months after Lushan, grain procurement in the worst affected provinces actually increased. More grain was taken from communities that had less grain. More people died because the political response to the evidence of starvation was to demand more from the people who were starving. The connection between cause and effect was severed by ideology, by the conviction that problems were always the result of insufficient revolutionary commitment, never the result of flawed policy. Mao knew the famine was real by the summer of 1959. After Lushan, the famine became, in a specific and documentable sense, his choice. The choice to prioritize political authority over the lives of the people he governed, and the choice to suppress accurate information in order to protect the great leap forward's ideological legitimacy. The choice to let the dying continue rather than admit that the policy had failed. The shape of the man Mao was, by the accounts of everyone who knew him well, a person of extraordinary intellectual presence. He read voraciously. Chinese history, Chinese poetry, philosophy, military theory, Western political thought. He had a memory for historical precedent that allowed him to produce, in conversation, relevant examples from 2,000 years of Chinese history. He was funny. There are numerous accounts of his humor, dark and oblique and often at the expense of people who couldn't afford not to laugh. He was charming, and in the specific way that powerful people who pay close attention to the person in front of them are charming. He was also a man who had authorized mass executions without apparent distress, who had watched his first wife die at the hands of the nationalists and his second wife die of illness during the Long March, who had sent his children into dangerous situations that resulted in significant harm, and who seemed, in the records of his conversations and his writings, to have a fundamentally different relationship to individual human death than most people have. Not sadistic, not gleeful, simply calculating. A death in the service of the revolution was acceptable. A death that resulted from someone's refusal to support the revolution was, in some sense, the person's own fault. The revolution required costs. The costs were paid. And he was also, in his later years, particularly after 1960, after the famine, after Lushan, a man increasingly isolated from accurate information. The terror that had been built into the system in the Yan'an years meant that people around Mao told him what he wanted to hear, because telling him what he didn't want to hear could end your career, your freedom, or your life. The Lushan conference had demonstrated this with perfect clarity. After Peng Dehuai, no senior official was going to write Mao another honest letter. The isolation was not only political, it was physical. Mao lived in the 1950s and 1960s in Zhongnanhai, the leadership compound adjacent to the Forbidden City in Beijing, and in his various villas and swimming pools around the country, attended by a large personal staff, shielded from contact with the population he governed by layers of security and deference. He swam. He read. He had a series of young women brought to him by his personal physician, a practice documented extensively in Li Jisui's memoir, The Private Life of Chairman Mao, published after Li's death. He made decisions that affected hundreds of millions of people from within a physical and informational bubble that those decisions had themselves created. How a famine is made. The Great Chinese Famine killed somewhere between 15 and 45 million people between 1959 and 1961. The range is wide because the Chinese government did not acknowledge the famine publicly for decades because the records from the period are incomplete and in some cases deliberately falsified, and because different methodological approaches to estimating excess deaths produce genuinely different numbers. The most widely cited scholarly estimate, produced by demographic historian Judith Bannister in the 1980s, puts the figure at approximately 30 million. Frank de Quota, working from provincial and county archives open to scholars in the 2000s, estimates between 45 and 55 million. Chinese demographic historian Yang Jisheng, whose research produced the book Tombstone, estimates between 36 and 45 million. The disagreement is real and methodologically significant. What no serious historian disputes is the order of magnitude. Tens of millions of people died who would not have died without the specific policy decisions of the Great Leap Forward. This is not a natural disaster with a political dimension. It is a political disaster with a demographic expression. The mechanism of the famine is not complicated. It was a feedback loop with no exit. Local officials reported inflated harvest figures to meet or exceed the targets set by the Great Leap Forward. The state set grain procurement quotas based on these inflated figures. When the actual harvest came in, already reduced by the diversion of agricultural labor to the backyard steel campaign, already reduced by the disruption of the commune system, already reduced by the elimination of the private plots that had provided a safety margin for individual families, there was not enough grain to meet the procurement quota. But the quota had to be met, because failure to meet the quota was political failure. So the state took everything. The grain that families needed to eat through winter, the grain that was needed as seed for the spring planting, all of it. When the grain was gone, people ate whatever they could find. Tree bark, grass roots, insects, corn husks, the leather of their belts and sandals, boiled until it could be swallowed. Then there was nothing left to eat, and people died. The speed of the dying varied by region and by the efficiency of the grain collection. Henan province was particularly severe because its provincial party secretary, Wu Jipu, was a zealot who had reported some of the most extravagant harvest figures in the country and whose grain collection teams were among the most thorough. Other provinces had party secretaries who, at personal risk, and falsified figures downward rather than upward, who reported lower harvests than they had, giving themselves a margin of grain to keep back for the population. These men were criminals under the logic of the system. They were the people who kept some of their communities alive. The commune system, life inside the machine. Understanding the famine requires understanding what the people's commune actually was and how it actually functioned, because the commune was the mechanism through which the state's policy reached individual bodies. Before collectivization, a Chinese peasant family had a specific and concrete relationship to food. They farmed their land. The harvest was theirs, subject to tax and to whatever obligations the landlord imposed. And the specific amount of food available in the household at any given time was something the family could see, count, and plan around. They could hide grain. They could save seed. They could manage their own consumption according to their own knowledge of what they had and what they needed. The commune destroyed all of this. Land was collective. Production was collective. Distribution was controlled by the commune administration. The family's private kitchen was replaced by the communal dining hall. The family's private grain store was replaced by the commune's collective warehouse. The family's own knowledge of their food situation was replaced by the commune cadre's reports, which, as we have seen, bore only a theoretical relationship to reality. The communal dining halls were initially celebrated as a liberation, and in the summer of 1958, when the harvest was still adequate and the state had not yet stripped the warehouses, some of them functioned as the propaganda promised. People ate well. There was food on the tables, sometimes more food than poor, rural families had ever had in one place at one time. The propaganda photographs from this period are real in the specific sense that the moment they depict actually occurred. What the photographs don't show is what happened 6 months later when the grain was gone and the halls had nothing to serve. The communal kitchen also created a specific and devastating problem. It eliminated the family's ability to ration. When a family controls its own food supply, it can cut back consumption voluntarily in times of scarcity. Eat less in winter to ensure enough seed grain for spring. The communal kitchen removed this option. The cadre who ran the kitchen served what the commune had, and when the commune had nothing, the kitchen served nothing, and the family had no reserve to fall back on. The elimination of private food storage, which was presented as the collectivization of resources, was in practice the elimination of the family's only buffer against the state's mismanagement. The cadres. Who did the killing? The famine was not produced by faceless bureaucratic forces. It was produced by specific decisions made by specific people at every level of the system, and understanding who those people were and what choices they made is essential to understanding how the machine worked. At the top level, the Mao made the decisions that created the system, the collectivization that put grain under state control, the production quotas that required inflated harvest reporting, the political culture that punished honest information and rewarded false success. At the bottom level, the grain collection teams, gangs of young men from the Commune Party apparatus, sometimes reinforced by soldiers, actually went to the villages and took the food. They were doing what they had been ordered to do by the cadres above them, who had been ordered to do it by the county, which had been ordered to do it by the prefecture, which had been ordered to do it by the province. In the middle were the county and commune cadres, the men who managed the interface between the state's requirements and the population's reality. These men were in an impossible position, but the impossibility did not exempt them from agency. They made choices. Some of them used the limited discretion available to them to protect their communities, by falsifying harvest figures downward, by setting aside small quantities of grain before the collection teams arrived. by refusing orders that were clearly going to kill people. These men risked their careers and sometimes their lives. Some of them saved thousands of people. Others made the opposite choice. The most extreme examples come from Xinjiang Prefecture in Henan, the area where the famine was most severe, where some cadres not only met their grain quotas but exceeded them, and where those who failed to meet their quotas were beaten or tortured by collection teams. There are documented cases of cadres beating people who were caught eating grain that had been designated for procurement. There are documented cases of people being denied medical treatment because they were labeled as rightists or saboteurs. There are documented cases of the gates of villages being locked so that starving people could not leave to search for food, because their departure would demonstrate to the outside world that the village was in trouble, which would reflect badly on the cadre responsible for it. The historian Yang Jisheng, who spent years interviewing survivors for his book Tombstone, collected testimony from across China. One account describes a village in which the cadre had all the remaining grain loaded onto carts while the village's children watched, and a child reached out and grabbed a handful of grain from a cart. The cadre had the child's hands beaten. The grain was taken. The child and most of the village subsequently died. This is what the machine looked like at ground level, not abstractions, not statistics. A child's hands beaten for a handful of grain. The cart moving away down the road. The cadre going home to write his report. The anti-rightist campaign and the destruction of truth. The Great Leap Forward did not operate in a political vacuum. It was preceded by, and in some ways precipitated by, the anti-rightist campaign of 1957, a mass political purge that destroyed the institutional capacity for honest reporting at precisely the moment when honest reporting was most needed. The anti-rightist campaign began with what appeared to be an opening. Mao, in early 1957, announced the 100 Flowers campaign with the slogan, "Let 100 flowers bloom, 100 schools of thought contend." Intellectuals, academics, and party officials were invited to offer criticism of the party's work, to contribute to the improvement of governance by identifying problems and proposing solutions. The invitation was taken seriously, perhaps more seriously than Mao intended, or perhaps precisely as seriously as he expected. Letters were written, speeches were given, wall posters appeared criticizing specific policies, specific officials, specific failures of the system. The response exceeded the officially anticipated boundaries. Critics were not marginal figures. They were professors, engineers, scientists, journalists, and loyal party members who had served the revolution and who offered a formal invitation to speak honestly, said things that were honest. They criticized the corruption of local officials. They criticized the cult of personality. Some drew explicit comparisons to Stalin. The wall posters at Beijing and Peking universities ran for hundreds of meters and covered topics that had not been discussed publicly in years. The flowers were blooming. They were not the flowers Mao had expected. Then the campaign reversed. In June 1957, Mao announced the anti-rightist campaign. All the people who had offered criticism were now labeled rightists. The criticism that had been invited was now evidence of anti-party sentiment. Whether the 100 Flowers campaign was a deliberate trap, an invitation to speak designed to identify critics so they could be eliminated, or whether it represents a genuine, if brief, liberalization that Mao then reversed when the criticism exceeded his tolerance, remains debated. Mao himself, in a 1957 speech, used a metaphor that implies forethought. He described the campaign as a way of luring snakes out of their caves. Whether the cave was prepared in advance or dug quickly when the snakes emerged, the result was the same. Over the following year, approximately 550,000 people were labeled as rightists. Teachers, scientists, writers, journalists, engineers, party members who had taken Mao at his word. They were stripped of their positions, sent to labor camps in the northwest and northeast, subjected to public denunciations by colleagues who had privately agreed with them. Some were executed. Many died in the camps, from the combination of hard labor, malnutrition, and the particular contempt that a system reserves for those it has designated as enemies of the people. The class of people most capable of providing accurate technical and policy analysis was decimated. The agricultural scientists who might have pointed out the impossibility of the production targets were in labor camps or under political supervision. The economists who might have modeled the commune system's consequences had been broken in struggle sessions. The journalists who might have reported the famine had been silenced. The feedback loop between policy and reality that a functioning government requires had been severed, not accidentally, but as a direct result of a campaign that Mao had chosen and directed. When the Great Leap Forward was announced in 1958, so it was announced into a political environment from which all meaningful opposition had been removed. The echo chamber was complete, and the echo chamber was about to kill tens of millions of people. The Cultural Revolution. The machine turned on itself. If the Great Leap Forward was Mao's attempt to remake the Chinese economy, the Cultural Revolution, launched in 1966 and lasting until Mao's death in 1976, though its most violent phase was concentrated between 1966 and 1969, was his attempt to remake Chinese society and the Chinese Communist Party itself. And it was the machine turned inward, the instruments of mass mobilization, terror, and ideological enforcement deployed not against landlords and capitalists, but against the party bureaucracy, the educational system, the cultural establishment, and ultimately against anyone who could be identified as insufficiently revolutionary. The Cultural Revolution began with an attack on a play. In 1965, Mao's wife Jiangxi and her allies published a critique of a historical drama called Hai Rui Dismissed from Office, written by the deputy mayor of Beijing, Wuhan. The drama was about a Ming dynasty official who was dismissed for criticizing the emperor. The critique argued that the drama was a veiled defense of Peng Dehuai, the general who had been purged at Lushan, and an attack on Mao. The accusation was a political weapon, not a literary argument, and it served as the opening shot of a campaign that would eventually consume the entire political and cultural establishment of China. Mao, in 1966, was 72 years old, and he was politically weakened by the catastrophic failure of the Great Leap Forward, which had forced a partial retreat from his policies in the early 1960s and had elevated more moderate figures, Liu Shaoqi, Deng Xiaoping, to greater influence in the party's day-to-day management. The Cultural Revolution was, in part, Mao's reassertion of total control. His attack on the revisionists in the party who had been quietly undoing some of the Great Leap's worst excesses. He mobilized a new instrument, the Red Guards. The Red Guards were primarily young, students in their teens and early 20s, high school and university students who had grown up in the People's Republic and been thoroughly indoctrinated in its political culture. They were organized outside the existing party structure, directly under Mao's symbolic authority, and when given a mission to destroy the four olds. Old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. What this meant in practice was the right and then the obligation to attack any person, any institution, any cultural artifact that could be labeled as feudal, capitalist, or revisionist. The Red Guards were, in their initial mobilization, genuinely idealistic. They were teenagers who had been told that the revolution was in danger, that enemies were lurking inside the party and inside society, that their generation had been chosen to complete the work that the founding generation had begun. They believed this. They had been raised in a system that had given them no framework for disbelieving it. When they organized into bands and marched through their schools and their cities, then pulling down signs and smashing antiques and hauling teachers onto stages to be denounced, they were, in their own understanding, doing the most important work in the world. The personal accounts of Red Guard participants are among the most disturbing documents of the Cultural Revolution period because so many of them describe the same trajectory. The initial excitement, the sense of mission and belonging and historical importance, the escalation into violence that felt righteous at the time, and then the aftermath, the recognition, sometimes immediate, sometimes years delayed, that what they had done was not what they had been told it was. Ray Yang, a Red Guard who later emigrated and wrote a memoir, describes beating a teacher with a belt and feeling, in the moment, nothing except the conviction that she was right. Young Chang, whose family memoir, Wild Swans, is one of the most widely read accounts of the period, describes watching teachers she had admired humiliated and destroyed by students who had been their pupils the previous week. What followed was one of the most sustained attacks on a society's own institutional and cultural foundations in modern history. Schools and universities were closed. Teachers were subjected to public struggle sessions, forced to kneel on stages while students screamed accusations at them, beaten, killed. Museums were ransacked, religious sites destroyed, books burned. The classical Chinese cultural heritage, the literature and art and architecture that represented thousands of years of civilization, was systematically attacked as evidence of feudal thinking, and an untold number of cultural artifacts were destroyed in the years between 1966 and 1969. The Red Guards eventually turned on each other. Different factions competed over ideological purity. Who was more authentically Maoist, who had more thoroughly carried out the mandate to destroy the old culture. The factional fighting became literal fighting, with rival Red Guard groups battling in the streets of Chinese cities with improvised weapons, occasionally with firearms. Entire neighborhoods were contested between factions. University campuses became battlegrounds. By 1969, Mao had to deploy the People's Liberation Army to restore order, to suppress the Red Guards that he had unleashed 3 years earlier. The death toll from the Cultural Revolution is estimated at between 500,000 and 2 million people killed directly. Beaten to death, he executed, driven to suicide. The numbers of people who were imprisoned, sent to labor camps, subjected to public humiliation, stripped of their positions and permanently damaged, are in the tens of millions. An entire generation of Chinese intellectuals and professionals was interrupted, damaged, or destroyed. The educational system was effectively shut down for a decade. The institutional capacity that China needed to develop, the trained scientists, engineers, doctors, teachers, administrators, was not produced during the Cultural Revolution years, and the cost of that absence is impossible to fully quantify. Mao watched. He issued directives. He occasionally intervened to moderate the worst excesses, and then he would swing back to encouraging the Red Guards. Note, he used the chaos of the Cultural Revolution to destroy his political enemies. Liu Shaoqi died in prison without medical treatment in 1969. He also let the chaos run beyond any specific political purpose, because the chaos was the point. Continuous revolution, continuous struggle, the prevention of the settled stability that Mao believed would corrupt the revolutionary spirit. He was, in the end, a man who had spent his life fighting chaos and could not live without it. The numbers, again, let us do what this series always does at this point: stand in front of the numbers and refuse to let them become abstract. The total death toll from Mao Zedong's rule is estimated by historians at between 40 and 80 million people. So the range reflects genuine uncertainty. The Great Leap Forward famine alone carries an uncertainty range of 30 million. And the uncertainty is itself a product of the system, which was designed to prevent accurate record-keeping of its own failures. The lower bound of 40 million dead is a figure that, if it were associated with any other 20th century leader, would place that leader in the company of history's most catastrophic perpetrators of mass death. The upper bound of 80 million is a number that exceeds the total casualties of the Second World War. The breakdown, the campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries, 1950 to 1953, between 700,000 and 2 million killed. Now, as the land reform campaigns of the early 1950s, approximately 1 to 2 million landlords and associated persons killed in public executions and mob violence. The anti-rightist campaign, 1957 to 1958. Approximately 550,000 people sent to labor camps, an unknown number of whom died. Direct executions in the lower thousands. The Great Leap Forward famine, 1959 to 1961. 15 to 45 million deaths from famine and associated disease, with the most careful demographic estimates clustering between 30 and 35 million. The Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976. Between 500,000 and 2 million killed directly, tens of millions persecuted, imprisoned, or permanently damaged. These numbers share one consistent feature: they are almost certainly undercounts. The incentive structure of the Maoist system was specifically designed to prevent accurate reporting of failure, death, and suffering. The people who might have kept accurate records had powerful reasons not to. The records that did exist were often destroyed or sealed. The survivors who might have borne witness were, for decades, living in a political environment where bearing witness was dangerous. The unnamed dead of Henan. The peasant in the doorway at the opening of this episode does not have a name in any archive. This is not an accident. The Great Leap Forward famine produced tens of millions of deaths in rural China, in communities that were geographically remote, administratively obscure, and politically powerless. The people who died were not urban intellectuals whose disappearances might have been noted by foreign journalists. They were not prominent officials whose purging might have attracted official attention. They were farmers and their children, and they died in the places where they had always lived, and the system that killed them was the same system responsible for recording their deaths, and that system had every incentive to record as few deaths as possible. Yang Jisheng was a journalist at the Xinhua news agency, the official state news agency of China, for most of his working life. He was a loyal party member. He was not a dissident. He began researching the famine in the 1990s, initially because his own father had died of hunger in 1959 when Yang was a teenager, and Yang had never known why. As he dug into the provincial and county archives that were beginning to open up in the post-Mao reform era, he began to understand. And he traveled to the provinces where the famine had been worst: Henan, Gansu, Qinghai, Sichuan, Anhui, and interviewed survivors. He collected documents. He read the internal party reports that described the famine in the dry administrative language of a system accounting for its own failures. He found people in their 70s and 80s who had never spoken publicly about what they had experienced. People carrying memories they had kept private for 50 years because the political environment had never made it safe to share them. He found detailed memories of specific deaths, neighbors, family members, children, preserved in the same kind of unwritten archive that survivors of other atrocities maintain. The knowledge that this happened, that it was real, that someone should know. What an account he collected describes a village where, in the winter of 1960, the only food available was a kind of paste made from rice husks, the outermost layer of the grain that humans cannot digest, that passes through the body without providing nourishment. People ate it because it filled the stomach temporarily, because the sensation of fullness was preferable to the sensation of emptiness, even when neither sensation was connected to actual nutrition. Children died of starvation with full stomachs. Parents who could not feed their children sometimes stopped feeding themselves in order to give the children marginally more. Some of those parents died. Some of those children survived. Another account describes a village where the cadre who had been responsible for exceeding the grain quota, the man who had reported the highest yields, who had been the most aggressive collector, was beaten to death by the surviving villagers after the famine ended. He was one of the few people whose death was, in any sense, the direct result of individual agency rather than systemic force. Most of those responsible for the famine lived out their careers without consequence. Yang Jisheng's father died in the famine. Yang traveled to his home county in Hubei to research the chapter on that region, and in researching the chapter, he was also researching his own family's loss. The personal and the historical are inseparable in Tombstone, which is part of what makes it one of the most important documents produced about the Maoist period. It was published in Hong Kong in 2008 and immediately banned in mainland China. It was never published in simplified Chinese, with the script used on the mainland. It remains banned. The book's title comes from a Chinese tradition. You erect a tombstone when someone dies, so that they are remembered. The tens of millions who died in the Great Leap Forward famine have, in most cases, no tombstone, no individual acknowledgement, no public memorial, no inscription. Yang Jisheng's book is the tombstone he could build. It is the size of the absence it is trying to mark. Mao's death and the official verdict. Mao Zedong died on September 9, 1976, in Beijing. He was 82 years old. The cause of death was a combination of complications from ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, which had been affecting him for several years, and cardiovascular disease. He died in the same compound he had lived in for most of his years in power, and is surrounded by the apparatus of the state he had built. The reaction in China was, officially, one of profound national mourning. Whatever private relief some people may have felt, and there is evidence that many did feel relief, though expressing it was not safe, the public response was the response that the system demanded. Grief. The Gang of Four, the radical faction that included Jiangxi, was arrested within a month of Mao's death, tried publicly, and imprisoned. Deng Xiaoping, who had been purged twice during the Cultural Revolution, returned to power and led the reform era that transformed China's economy over the following decades. In 1981, had the Chinese Communist Party issued its official verdict on Mao's life and work. The resolution on certain questions in the history of our party since the founding of the People's Republic of China. The verdict was careful, political, and historically dishonest in precisely calibrated ways. It acknowledged that Mao had made serious errors in his later years, that the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution had been mistakes. It described Mao as 70% correct and 30% incorrect, a formulation that had the virtue of mathematical precision and the vice of being essentially meaningless. It explicitly preserved Mao's status as the founding father of the People's Republic, as the indispensable revolutionary leader without whom China would not have been unified and liberated. And Mao's portrait still hangs over Tiananmen Gate. His embalmed body still lies in the mausoleum in Tiananmen Square, where visitors queue daily to view it. The Mao Zedong thought that the party officially endorses as one of its guiding principles is understood to refer to his pre-1949 revolutionary thought, not to the Great Leap Forward or the Cultural Revolution. The distinction is politically convenient and historically artificial. The thinking that produced the Cultural Revolution did not arrive in 1966 from nowhere. It was the direct extension of the thinking that had produced the Yan'an Rectification Campaign, the anti-rightist campaign, the Great Leap Forward. It was the same mind, applying the same logic to a different problem: how China remembers. China's relationship to the Maoist period is one of the most carefully managed historical memories in the world. The Chinese state has not denied that the Great Leap Forward produced a famine. It has not denied that the Cultural Revolution was a disaster. These things are in the history textbooks, acknowledged in the official resolution, part of what the party presents as its capacity for honest self-criticism. What the state has not done is allow the full scale of the disaster to be publicly known, publicly discussed, or publicly mourned. Tombstone is banned. The most comprehensive scholarly studies of the famine by Chinese historians are not published in China, and the estimated death toll of 30 to 45 million people, which would require monuments and curricula and public reckoning of the kind that Germany has built around the Holocaust, is not part of Chinese public discourse. The individual stories of the famine dead, the specific villages and families and children, are not part of the national narrative. The reason for this is not difficult to understand. The Chinese Communist Party governs China today. It governed China during the Great Leap Forward. It is the institutional continuation of the organization that created and maintained the system that killed tens of millions of people. And a full public reckoning with the Maoist period would require the party to acknowledge that its founding leader committed mass atrocities on a scale comparable to Stalin and Hitler, a comparison that is historically defensible and politically explosive. It would require the party to explain why it continued to govern China in the name of an ideology and a tradition that includes these events. It would require an accounting of a kind that no currently governing political party has ever fully offered about its own crimes. The result is a managed silence. The events happened. They are acknowledged in their broad outlines. The detailed human cost, the names, the stories, the individual deaths, is not publicly accessible. The families that lost members in the famine carry their knowledge privately. The scholars who try to research it find archives that are open until they are closed, sources that are available until they are not, a bureaucratic landscape that is permissive in some directions and suddenly, without warning, blocked in others. Xi Jinping's government, which took power in 2012, has moved in the direction of greater, not lesser, restriction on historical inquiry into the Maoist period. Discussions of the famine on social media are censored. Scholars who publish internationally on the topic find their access to Chinese archives reduced. The window that opened briefly in the 1980s and 1990s, when some provincial archives became accessible to researchers and some survivors were able to speak, has been partially closed. What Mao tells us, Mao Zedong, is the most difficult subject in this series, in a specific way. He is difficult not because the facts are unclear. The facts are, within the ranges described, well established. but because of the extraordinary complexity of his historical position. He was genuinely responsible for the liberation of China from a century of foreign domination and internal fragmentation. He was genuinely responsible for mass atrocities that killed tens of millions of people. Both things are true simultaneously, and the simultaneous truth is harder to hold in the mind than either statement alone. The difficulty is compounded by the fact that many of the people who suffered most under his rule, the rural peasantry, the people who died in the famine and were persecuted in the Cultural Revolution, were the people whose liberation he had dedicated his life to achieving. This is not an irony that sits lightly on the history. It is the central wound of the Maoist period. The revolution that promised to end the exploitation of the peasantry created a system that extracted food from peasant families while their children died. The ideology that promised equality created the most pervasive system of political terror that China had ever experienced. The leader who fought all his life against foreign domination built a state that dominated its own citizens with a thoroughness that the foreign powers had never achieved. Several things produced this outcome, and they are not reducible to a single cause. The first is the structure of the system. The Soviet model one-party state that Mao built in China was not designed to produce accurate information, because it was not designed to be accountable to the people it governed. A government accountable to its citizens has an incentive to know when its policies are failing, because the citizens will punish it at the ballot box. A government accountable only to itself has an incentive to suppress information about policy failures, because such information threatens the authority of the leadership. The famine was not kept secret from the Chinese leadership because Chinese officials were especially dishonest or cowardly. It was kept secret because the system rewarded the suppression of bad news and punished the reporting of it. A different institutional structure would have produced different information flows. Different information flows would have produced policy adjustments. Policy adjustments would have saved millions of lives. This is one of the clearest demonstrations in modern history of what economists and political scientists call the information problem of authoritarian governance. It is a structural problem, not a problem of individual virtue. Even a well-intentioned authoritarian leader, embedded in a system that punishes honest reporting, will receive systematically distorted information. And if that leader then makes policy on the basis of the distorted information, as Mao did with the Great Leap Forward targets, which were based on harvest figures that bore no relationship to reality, the policies will be systematically disconnected from actual conditions. The disaster does not require malice. It requires only a sufficiently broken feedback loop. The second is the specific psychology of Mao himself, for his voluntarism, his conviction that human will can overcome material constraint, that ideology can substitute for knowledge, that the right revolutionary spirit can produce outcomes that the evidence says are impossible, was not a personality quirk. It was a systematic worldview with systematic implications. A leader who believes that the failure of a policy reflects insufficient revolutionary commitment rather than a flawed policy will respond to failure by demanding more commitment rather than changing the policy. This is what happened with the Great Leap Forward. The evidence of failure arrived in 1959. The response was to intensify the demands. The intensification killed more people than the original failure. The voluntarism had roots that went deeper than Marxist theory, and it was connected to Mao's reading of Chinese history, to the great rebel heroes of the novels he had read as a child, to the tradition of the heroic individual who changes history through the force of his will. It was connected to the Long March and the lesson he had drawn from surviving it, that determination defeats material constraint. It was connected, at its deepest level, to the psychological pattern established in the household of Mao Yichang, the lesson that total resistance, however costly, produces results that submission does not. The third is the problem of unchecked power over time. Mao, at 50, in the early years of the People's Republic, was making difficult decisions in genuinely difficult circumstances, managing the consolidation of a new state, navigating the Korean War, managing the relationship with the Soviet Union, dealing with real threats from real enemies. The campaigns of those early years were brutal, and the deaths were real, but there was a relationship between the threats the government faced and the responses it chose. Mao, at 65, during the Great Leap Forward, was making catastrophic decisions in the absence of any institutional mechanism to challenge them, surrounded by people whose careers and lives depended on telling him he was right. The unchecked power had, over 15 years, produced a decision-making environment in which accurate information could not reach the decision-maker, because accurate information was indistinguishable in the political culture that power had created from counter-revolutionary sabotage. These three factors, the structure of the state, the psychology of the leader, and the corrupting effect of unchecked power over time, are not unique to China or to Mao. They are the recurring elements of the story this series has been telling in different configurations across every episode. Every system of mass atrocity we have examined has featured some combination of institutional structures that suppress accurate information, ideologies that make the costs of policy invisible or acceptable, and leaders whose power has grown beyond any capacity for accountability. The girl in the doorway at the beginning of this episode, the one whose name is not in any archive, did not die because Mao Zedong was uniquely evil. She died because a system was built that was incapable of seeing her. That is a different and, in some ways, a more disturbing conclusion, because it implies that the conditions that produce such systems are not rare. They are the default condition of human political organization when certain institutional safeguards are absent. The safeguards are not guaranteed. They are built, maintained, contested, and sometimes dismantled, generation after generation, and the cost of their absence can be counted in the kind of numbers we have been dealing with today. In Henan province, in the areas where the famine was worst, there are villages that have not recovered their pre-1959 population. The demographic hole punched by the Great Leap Forward famine is visible, 65 years later, in the age structure of these communities. In the missing generation, the people who were not born because their parents died, the people who left and never came back, to the families that were simply interrupted, their continuity broken by a policy decided in a compound in Beijing by a man who never visited a hungry village in the years when the hunger was killing people. There is a specific and documented fact about Mao's personal behavior during the famine years that seems right to end with. During the period of the Great Leap Forward famine, the years when somewhere between 15 and 45 million people were dying of hunger in rural China, Mao continued to eat extremely well. His personal chef, a man named Cheng Ruiming who worked in Zhongnanhai for years, described the meals: multiple dishes, good fish, meat dishes, the food of a man with no concern about where his next meal was coming from. His personal physician, Li Jisui, described the same. Mao ate. China starved. The distance between his table and the communes he governed was not physical distance. It was the distance created by a system specifically designed to ensure that the conditions outside never reached the man inside. History is not a museum of closed cases. The questions raised by the Maoist period are not historical questions. They are present questions. the Chinese government's management of information about COVID-19 in the early weeks of 2020, the suppression of reports from Wuhan doctors, the delay in acknowledging human-to-human transmission, the punishment of officials who raised alarms, followed a pattern that would have been recognizable to any student of the Great Leap Forward. Not because Xi Jinping is Mao Zedong, but because the institutional structure that suppresses bad news in the service of political authority is still, in important respects, the structure that Mao built. The machine is not always running at full speed, but the machine is still there. And the girl in the doorway is still waiting for someone to look at her.